Move it! Get it away from her right now! A chair slammed back. Someone shouted for oxygen. The monitor's pitch spiked, shrill and uneven. Her heart rate is collapsing. Hands crowded the crib, too many, too fast. A woman's voice cracked open in a way that couldn't be fixed. "Please, not my baby, please!" And then, from the edge of the room, almost lost in the noise, "It's not her fault." Silence. "It's the room." For 3 days, a billionaire's newborn daughter had been dying inside a mansion built to keep suffering invisible. 20 doctors failed her, the best money could buy, the kind flown in quietly and paid never to be wrong. Machines ran, numbers updated, solutions were discussed. Nothing worked. And the truth didn't come from the center of the room. It came from someone no one thought to listen to. This is the story of Naomi Carter and what happens when silence finally breaks. The Whitmore estate sat on the outer edge of Greenwich, Connecticut, hidden behind iron gates and hedges trimmed with surgical precision. From the road, the house looked peaceful, unchanged by time, insulated from consequence. It was designed that way. Everything about the place suggested control, symmetry, order, permanence. Jonathan Whitmore liked it that way. As the founder of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country, Jonathan had built his life on systems that worked: clinical trials, peer review, data that obeyed logic. He believed deeply that chaos was a failure of preparation, not fate. His wife, Evelyn, believed in readiness. Their calendar was managed months in advance. Their home was staffed by professionals. Their child would grow up wrapped in layers of expertise and protection. Their daughter, Claire, was born into a world that promised solutions. Naomi Carter entered that world through the service entrance. At 16, Naomi helped her mother clean the Whitmore house after school. Her mother, Renee Carter, had worked in homes like this for years, quietly, methodically, without incident. Renee treated every job like a contract with survival itself. "There are houses where mistakes cost pride," she used to tell Naomi, "and houses where they cost everything." Naomi understood. She learned how to move without sound, how to keep her eyes lowered without looking afraid, how to exist as function, not presence. In places like the Whitmores, invisibility wasn't cruelty, it was expectation. The guest cottage where Naomi and Renee lived sat behind the hedges, just far enough to remind them they didn't belong inside the glow of the main house. From their window, Naomi could see the mansion lit up at night, bright enough to erase darkness. That glow had always meant work. Now it meant something else. The first night, Claire cried differently, Naomi noticed. She was polishing the banister outside the nursery when the sound reached her. Thin, uneven, nothing like the sharp hunger cries she'd heard before. This cry didn't demand, it pleaded. By morning, the crying had weakened. By nightfall, it stopped altogether. The house responded the only way it knew how, by summoning expertise. Cars arrived late. Men and women in pressed coats moved through the halls with urgency that tried to look like confidence. Voices lowered, then tightened. The language of certainty began to fracture. Naomi watched from the margins, mop in hand. She wasn't meant to understand what was happening. She wasn't meant to care. But something about the silence that settled over the house made her uneasy. This place wasn't built for failure. Jonathan Whitmore paced the halls with his phone buzzing unanswered in his hand. Evelyn hadn't slept. Her hair came loose from its careful styling, mascara faintly smudged beneath her eyes. She sat by the nursery window for hours, staring at her daughter, as if focus alone might pull her back. Naomi had never seen wealth look so fragile. She wiped counters no one noticed anymore, replaced untouched food trays, listened. And all the while, something in her stomach tightened, because she recognized the quiet, the kind that meant time was slipping. By the second day, the doctors stopped smiling. Naomi noticed the change immediately. Confidence had drained from their movements. Conversations grew shorter, clipped by fatigue. Words like monitor and observe replaced certainty. The language shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The nursery filled with expertise. A pediatric cardiologist from Boston leaned over the crib, frowning at numbers that refused to stabilize. A neonatologist from California murmured possibilities under her breath. A private nurse adjusted IV lines with hands that never shook, even as her eyes betrayed doubt. Claire lay still, her tiny chest rising unevenly. Naomi wiped down surfaces no one noticed anymore, listening. She heard idiopathic, a word that sounded clinical but meant surrender. She heard rare complication. And then, late in the afternoon, she heard surgery. It was said quietly, like something dangerous if spoken too loudly. Naomi's stomach dropped. She stood in the hallway outside the nursery, heart pounding, staring through the open door. Claire's skin had gone pale, lips dry, lashes too still against her cheeks. Naomi had seen children look like this once before, when the body was fighting but losing ground. She thought about her cousin Malik years ago, gasping on the kitchen floor while adults froze around him, about how her grandmother hadn't frozen, about how knowing something, anything, had made the difference. Naomi's gaze drifted toward the windowsill. The plant stood there, exactly where it had always been. Tall, glossy, imported, the kind of gift people sent when words felt insufficient. It was beautiful in a way that discouraged questions. Everyone accepted it as harmless. Everyone except her. She had noticed the leaves the day before, thick, waxy, too perfect, the faint residue they left behind when wiped, the way the crib sat just inches away. Her grandmother's voice surfaced uninvited in her memory. The pretty ones don't warn you. Naomi told herself she was reaching, that fear made connections where none existed, that she was a 16-year-old girl without credentials, standing in a house full of people who had spent decades earning the right to speak. But she also knew this: every single person in that room was operating inside their role. Doctors diagnosed, parents hoped, staff stayed silent. And silence, she was beginning to realize, was not neutral. If you've ever been in a room where something felt wrong, if you've ever known the truth but doubted your right to say it, then you understand the weight Naomi carried in that moment. Choosing to stay with a story like this isn't entertainment, it's recognition. It's saying that voices without titles still matter, that quiet knowledge still counts. Naomi pressed her back against the wall, heart racing, and for the first time since the baby fell ill, she understood that waiting was no longer safe. The plant had arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before Claire was born. It came with no explanation, just a delivery slip and a card tucked into the ribbon. Cream paper, embossed lettering, the kind people sent when money felt easier than words. Naomi remembered unwrapping it with her mother, careful not to tear the silk, careful not to ask who it was from. "Put it by the nursery window," Evelyn had said distractedly, already turning away. "It'll get good light there." So Naomi did. She placed it carefully, centered between the glass panes where the morning sun would hit it just right. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. Houses like this were full of beautiful things that meant nothing to her. But now, standing outside the nursery days later, Naomi couldn't stop seeing it. The leaves were thick, unnaturally so, dark green, glossy, almost waxed. When she wiped the sill beneath it, the cloth came away with a faint oily smear that took extra effort to remove. The flowers hung downward, bell-shaped and pale, deceptively soft. Naomi's grandmother had once pulled her hand back sharply from a similar-looking plant in Savannah. "That one slows the heart," she'd said. "Doesn't sting, doesn't burn, just convinces the body to stop trying." Naomi hadn't understood it then. She understood now. Every time she glanced at the crib, at Claire's shallow breathing, her tiny chest rising and falling like it was tired of the effort, Naomi's gaze drifted back to the window. The doctors never looked there. They looked at machines, at charts, at each other.
They discussed rare conditions, uncommon syndromes, possibilities that live deep inside the body. No one talked about the room. No one questioned the environment, because the room was expensive, designed, controlled, safe. Naomi leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She told herself that if it were the plant, someone else would notice, someone trained, someone with authority. But authority had blinded them. This wasn't the first time Naomi had seen that happen. At school, teachers ignored kids who didn't raise their hands the right way. At work, people talked over staff like they were furniture. In rooms full of power, the loudest voices were trusted, even when they were wrong. The truth didn't announce itself loudly. It waited. Naomi closed her eyes and ran through the symptoms again. Bradycardia, fatigue, feeding refusal. She knew the plant's name. She hadn't said it out loud yet, not even to herself. Saying it would make this real. Saying it would mean she couldn't walk away anymore. She exhaled slowly. The monitor inside the nursery let out a brief, uneven beep. Naomi's eyes snapped open. Time was thinning.
Naomi retreated to the service stairwell, the only place in the house that still felt neutral. She sat on the bottom step, elbows on her knees, hands shaking despite her effort to keep them still. From here, the noise of the house dulled into a low hum, voices muffled, footsteps distant, urgency softened but never gone. This was where she hid when things felt too big. She thought of her mother. Renee Carter had survived by mastering the art of disappearance. She never argued, never assumed, never took up more space than necessary. In houses like the Whitmores, invisibility was not humiliation, it was armor. People like us, Renee used to say, folding laundry with practiced precision, don't get second chances, so we don't take risks. Naomi had believed that. She still did. Her chest tightened as she imagined what would happen if she spoke and was wrong. The quiet meeting, the professional smiles, the polite explanations. Her mother packing their things into boxes, trying not to cry. She imagined the alternative, the surgery, the failed intervention, the funeral spoken about in hushed tones, followed by statements and settlements. She imagined knowing, forever, that she had seen the truth and chosen silence. That was heavier. The stairwell felt too small. Naomi stood and paced, running a hand through her hair, breath shallow. She wasn't brave, she wasn't confident, she was terrified. And yet, something had shifted, because she understood now that silence wasn't safety, it was permission. Permission for the wrong things to continue simply because no one challenged them. She walked back toward the nursery. With every step, doubt tried to pull her backward. Who was she to contradict 20 doctors? Who was she to interrupt grief? She stopped just outside the door. Jonathan Whitmore stood near the foot of the crib, face rigid, jaw clenched. Evelyn sat by the window, eyes hollow, one hand pressed to her mouth. The monitor beeped again, uneven. Naomi felt something inside her settle. Fear didn't disappear, but clarity arrived.
It's the plant. The words left Naomi's mouth before she could stop them. The room froze. Every conversation cut off at once. A nurse turned sharply. One of the doctors frowned, confusion flashing across his face before irritation followed. Jonathan Whitmore turned slowly. "What did you say?" he asked. Naomi's heart hammered so loudly she was sure it could be heard. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to keep them still. "The plant by the window," she said again, voice unsteady but clear. "It's toxic. Even small exposure can slow a baby's heart." A doctor let out a short laugh, reflexive, dismissive, then stopped himself when Jonathan raised a hand. "Explain," Jonathan said. Naomi swallowed. "My grandmother taught me about plants. That one releases cardiac toxins. It doesn't burn, it doesn't smell strong, it just convinces the body to stop." Silence followed. Not angry silence, calculating silence. Jonathan's eyes flicked to the windowsill. "Check it," he said. The plant was moved, gloves snapped on. Someone searched quickly on a tablet, face draining of color as results loaded. The monitors shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Claire's heart rate steadied. Oxygen levels climbed, slowly, cautiously, but upward. Evelyn collapsed into a chair, sobbing openly now, hands covering her face. No one spoke. Jonathan Whitmore looked at Naomi, not as staff, not as background, not as an inconvenience, as a human being. "You saved my daughter," he said quietly. Naomi felt her knees weaken. She hadn't planned for this part. She hadn't imagined being believed. She had only prepared herself to be dismissed. And if you've ever been taught to doubt your voice, if you've ever stayed silent because the room didn't feel like it belonged to you, then you understand how heavy that moment was. Staying with a story like this isn't passive. It's a recognition that truth doesn't always come dressed in authority. It's a quiet refusal to let invisibility decide whose knowledge matters. Naomi exhaled for the first time in days. The room breathed with her.
The room did not erupt in celebration. There were no cheers, no relieved laughter, no triumphant declarations. Instead, the nursery exhaled, the kind of release that comes after holding fear too tightly for too long. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, now calmer, less erratic. The doctors did not rush to speak. They moved carefully, deliberately, as if any sudden motion might break whatever fragile balance had just been restored. Claire slept. For the first time in days, her breathing no longer looked like effort. Evelyn Whitmore remained seated by the crib, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She didn't wipe her tears away. She didn't try to compose herself. The performance of control had finally collapsed, and with it came something truer, raw relief mixed with delayed terror. Jonathan stood apart from the others. He had spent his life commanding rooms like this, conference halls, board meetings, regulatory hearings. He was used to certainty flowing toward him, to answers arriving because he demanded them. This room was different now. The answer had arrived without his permission, and it had come from someone he hadn't trained himself to see. He watched as the doctors recalibrated their understanding, quietly correcting themselves without excuses. One by one, they acknowledged what had happened, not aloud, not formally, but in the way they shifted their posture, in the absence of defensiveness. No one argued. No one tried to minimize it. They knew. The crisis hadn't been solved by brilliance or funding or access. It had been solved by attention. Naomi stood near the doorway, unsure what to do with her hands now that they were no longer shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation drained quickly, leaving behind exhaustion and something like disbelief. She had expected consequences. Instead, she felt suspended. Evelyn looked up and caught Naomi's eyes. She didn't say thank you right away. She just looked, really looked, not as staff, not as background, not as the help, as a girl who had seen something true. And in that look, Naomi felt something shift. It wasn't approval, it wasn't praise, it was recognition. Later that night, after the doctors had left and the house finally quieted, Renee found Naomi sitting on the edge of her bed in the guest cottage, staring at her hands. "You okay?" Renee asked softly. Naomi nodded, then shook her head, then laughed once, breathlessly. "I think so," she said. "I don't know." Renee sat beside her, eyes full of questions she hadn't yet learned how to ask. "I taught you to stay invisible," Renee said, after a moment. It wasn't an apology. It was a reckoning. Naomi didn't answer right away. "You taught me how to survive," she said finally. "But today, surviving wasn't enough." They sat in silence, the weight of the day settling between them. The house felt different now, not kinder,
not suddenly equal, but changed, because something irreversible had happened. The illusion that knowledge only lived in certain bodies had cracked, and once cracked, it could not be sealed again.
Claire's recovery was not dramatic. There was no overnight miracle, no moment where she suddenly opened her eyes and laughed. Healing came slowly, in increments small enough that only people paying close attention would notice. But Naomi noticed. She noticed the color returning to Claire's skin, the steadier rise and fall of her chest, the way Evelyn began to sit back in her chair instead of leaning forward like she was bracing for loss. Time resumed its forward motion, and with it came conversations that could no longer be avoided. Jonathan Whitmore asked Naomi to meet him in the sunroom a week later. The room was bright with morning light, glass walls overlooking manicured lawns that had once felt untouchable. Jonathan didn't sit behind a desk. He didn't stand. He sat across from her. "I've spent my life believing expertise always comes with credentials," he said, "that if someone knows something important, the system will surface them." He paused. It didn't. Naomi listened without speaking. "I didn't see you," he continued, "not until you made it impossible not to." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He corrected the system instead. Renee was promoted, not quietly, not temporarily, but formally. Her role expanded, her authority acknowledged. Naomi was offered a scholarship fund created in her grandmother's name, focused on community health, environmental awareness, and the kinds of knowledge that rarely made it into textbooks. But Naomi didn't feel victorious. She felt grounded, because the story had never been about reward. It had been about consequence, about what happens when truth is allowed to live, or is quietly buried because of who carries it. Weeks later, Naomi visited her grandmother's old neighborhood in Savannah. She walked past the fence where she'd once reached for the wrong plant. She stood in the heat and remembered hands pulling her back, a voice explaining calmly what danger looked like when it pretended to be harmless. She understood now what her grandmother had really been teaching her. Not plants, attention. The world is full of quiet truths, Naomi realized, full of people who see clearly but have learned to doubt themselves because no one taught them their seeing mattered. And the cost of ignoring those people is always paid by the most vulnerable. If this story stayed with you, if it made you uncomfortable in a way that felt honest, then staying with stories like this is not consumption, it's participation. It's choosing to believe that truth does not belong to the loudest voice in the room, but to the one brave enough to speak when silence feels safer. This is BoldVerse Stories, where quiet courage is not overlooked, where invisibility is not destiny, where the truth, no matter where it comes from, is allowed to matter.